The kitten raised by the campus heartthrob has claimed me. A tiny bundle, it's flopped on its back, fast asleep beside my pillow. The first time I returned the cat, the school idol and I took an instant dislike to each other. Alas, with a harem of 3,000 admirers, the little con artist keeps bumping into only me. The heartthrob got anxious, hoisted up his unfilial son, and demanded, "So, who do you love most, daddy or mommy?" Main story. Big Rose, the child Brian Anderson cherished as if it were his own. Back then, he had just finished the pre-semester military training for freshmen. On his way back from a meal with his new roommates, he happened to see a few students trying to rescue a kitten. He'd never been interested in keeping pets. He was about to skirt around the crowd when, for no clear reason, a tiny milk kitten grabbed his pant leg and claimed him. At the time, Big Rose was still a palm-sized pitiful scrap, claws hooked around his shoelace, unable to get down, eyes squeezed shut as it wailed itself hoarse. And so Brian and his roommates brought it back to the dorm. Even though the dorm manager had repeatedly stressed that illegal appliances were forbidden, and so were living creatures, there's always a way around a rule. One roommate borrowed kitten formula from a girl he knew. At least the little thing made it through the day. Around T University there were, besides internet cafes, 2 rather hidden bars, quite tempting for college students at the time. A few of them had planned to go take a look after class that day, but then Brian ran into a problem. Come nightfall, the kitten couldn't see Brian and worked itself into a panic, mewling nonstop in the dorm until its throat nearly gave out, then it collapsed on the bed and started throwing up milk. When Brian came back to change clothes, he found his bed an absolute disaster. Perhaps the little guy had cried himself tired, because he fell sound asleep right where he'd vomited. So much for nightlife, sleep itself became a problem for Brian that night. Luckily, the supermarket outside sold clean emergency bedding sets. He bundled up his sheet and tossed it in the outside trash, then came back to see the little thing sprawled in a corner, fast asleep with all 4 paws in the air. Even if he wasn't much of an animal lover, Brian couldn't truly lose his temper at a tiny kitten. But just as he grabbed a jacket to go buy new sheets, the kitten suddenly woke up. Its fur was still damp with milk, yet it staggered and tottered toward him in a wobbly little run. Brian had no choice but to tuck it into the pocket of his track jacket and take it along to the supermarket. Later, someone secretly snapped a photo of Brian with the kitten in his pocket and posted it on the school's confession wall. Overnight, he became a sensation. Not only did he snatch the title of T University's campus Adonis, he also drew an endless stream of suitors. By the time the kitten was 2 months old, its personality had turned lively and mischievous. It refused to behave in the dorm. Once, it wriggled through a shop's fence and ended up lost outside a far-off library. Back then, the university's control of stray cats and dogs wasn't strict, and you'd occasionally see familiar furry faces wandering about. The kitten ran into a poodle a student had abandoned, small in size but vicious. Chased to desperation, it bolted headlong into the adjacent greenbelt and snagged its hind leg on a dead twig, trembling all over. It couldn't help mewing in pain. I happened to be passing by. The high and mighty poodle from a moment earlier turned pathetic the instant it spotted a person. Head drooping, it slunk off to the side. When I came out of the library it was completely dark. As I walked past the shrubs, I thought I heard a sound, probably a mouse, I figured, but the farther I went, the sharper and more pitiful the sound became. That didn't sound like a mouse at all. So I doubled back, turned on my phone's flashlight, and crouched by the greenbelt, following the sound. It didn't take much effort to fish out a little orange kitten. Its hind leg was smeared with blood, clearly injured. Once I scooped it up, it stopped crying. With no one else around, I took it back to my dorm to treat the wound. While I dabbed medicine on it, the kitten trembled with pain yet still nestled obediently against me, curled into a soft, tiny ball. My roommate came back even later than I did. The moment she walked in, she launched into the day's hot gossip. You know what? This afternoon someone posted that the campus heartthrob's cat is missing. My God, half the girls in school went out to look for it. What a scene. She had barely finished when she saw the kitten snoring away on my cushion. She was dumbfounded. Where'd you pick that up? I didn't lift my head, my eyes stayed on my book as I answered casually, in front of the library. She smacked her lips and said, "See? This is why you gotta study more." The next day I found a way to contact the campus heartthrob. After we agreed on a meeting place, I returned the little orange cat. That was my first time meeting Brian. There were no fireworks of love at first sight. Honestly, for a boy like Brian, excellent family background, outstanding in every way, I, the book nerd, top of the class type, made no particular impression. As it happened, I myself harbored a slight bias against men who are a little too good-looking. Our first meeting began with a hello and ended with a thank you. At least one of us didn't even score the other above passing. Yet that very night, I was jolted awake by a sudden purr beside my pillow. Brian's orange kitten, by some means or another, had found its way back to my dorm, and snuck right in. The second time I showed up at his door with the cat dangling from my hand, Brian had no energy left to judge my prim wardrobe. A cat you raised with your own hand sneaking off to someone else's dorm to bum a bed, being rejected by your own son, hardly stings less. This time we skipped the polite pretense. As I left, only the kitten still rubbed against my coat sleeve, reluctant to part. Soon enough, though, we met a second time, and a third. The next time I heard that sudden little purr in the dead of night, I calmly rolled over and went back to sleep. Half awake, I even considered whether I should buy a simple little cat bed. By the next morning, the cat bed had practically delivered itself to my door. Along with it came kitten food and formula, hairball paste, litter, and a few simple toys. And, incidentally, a Brian whose expression wasn't great. His meaning was simple: since his cat liked to stay here, we might as well board it in my dorm, he'd continue to provide the necessities. I refused. Unlike Brian's spacious double room, I lived in a standard 4-person dorm. Personal space was already scarce, there was simply no room to keep a pet. Because of the cat's living arrangements, we parted on bad terms yet again. As winter break approached, the school organized a 2-person debate tournament. The topic was a bit out there, and I was picked as the first speaker for the affirmative. But the opening went badly. In the first round our second speaker got ground into the floor by the opposition. Before round 2 began, something happened to our teammate at the last minute, and we had to replace the second speaker. As the saying goes, last-minute substitutions are lethal. I went in thinking, how much worse can it get? And then saw that the new second speaker was Brian. I was baffled. But once the debate started, I realized that this seemingly careless rich kid was not only a partner you could trust to guard your back, but also a blade with a gleaming edge. In the end, victory didn't even surprise me. From then on, the competitions were less about winning and more about enjoying the process of teaming up with Brian. After the tournament, we received a sponsor's prize, a newly developed robot vacuum. The day we went to pick it up, snow began to fall suddenly and piled thick within a few hours. We walked slowly along the gravel path toward the dorms, Brian carrying the vacuum, me holding the cat. The orange kitten loved burrowing into my down jacket. Pressed against a soft, warm sweater, it poked out a furry little head and stared curiously at the drifting flakes. Afraid it might slip, I crossed my arms over my stomach, one hand cupping the kitten's rump, trudging forward through the snow, step by careful step. Brian trudged ahead alone with the bulky machine. His limbs were long and his stride was wide, in no time he'd drawn far ahead of us. Knowing full well my legs weren't 1.80 meters, I dawdled behind with the kitten, stamping patterns in the snow as I went. Suddenly Brian stopped. He stood there waiting for a bit, then couldn't help turning back. I was holding up a handful of snow for the kitten to see. My cheeks and nose had been chilled red by the wind, and even my eyelashes were tipped with frost. Brian stood beside me, lowered his head at who knows what, and suddenly asked, "How tall are you?" I was puzzled, but answered honestly, 164. I'm 189. I was at a loss, then startled to find that he was practically right next to me, so close I only had to tilt my head back to see the clean line of his jaw. The snow fell harder, evening closed in, the lights along the gravel path flicked on one by one, making the flakes even clearer. I lifted a hand to catch one and held it in front of the kitten's eyes. The little thing, not understanding, gave it a tentative lick, and my palm's warmth sent a shiver through its whole body. I couldn't help laughing. When I looked up, Brian was still there ahead, not leaving. "Why don't you go on first?" Since we'd just worked together in the debate, I offered an awkward explanation. "I'm bundled up, so I'll be slower in the snow." Brian said nothing. He turned back and walked a few steps ahead, but this time he deliberately slowed down, shortening his stride. I hesitated, then quietly hugged the cat and stepped into the footprints Brian had already stamped flat in the snow. Most of the time, the orange kitten preferred to cling to me. It was growing fast, a jacket pocket could now barely fit its head. So I wore looser coats more often, so I could smuggle it against my chest into the library. Brian was happy to play the empty nest dad, stocking cat food and dried fish in the dorm each day. He even asked for my class schedule. When I had lectures, he'd pick the cat up in advance. After feeding his rebellious son to satiety, he'd bring it back right as my class ended. If he arrived early, he'd simply stand at the classroom door with the cat and wait. At first, it caused a stir. Even Brian's childhood friend had a laugh. "If you know, you know, it's a handoff. If you don't, you'd think you're picking up your girlfriend after class every day." By the time that joke reached my ears, its flavor had already changed. Our class had no shortage of Brian's admirers, and the whispers began to spread. They said I was lucky to have found Brian's cat. They said I must be so good at keeping cats that even the owner had fallen under my spell. The nice, the nasty, and the pointedly targeted, all condensed into a teasing glance or a peculiar smile. But at the time, I could still stand upright, armor polished and impenetrable. Brian can't stomach the cafeteria's breakfast, so sometimes he orders dim sum delivery from nearby restaurants. If he happens to pick up the cat right when I have an early class, he'll order an extra set and bring it along. Of course I refuse, and Brian doesn't push. It's just that next time he does the same, with the extra food he can't finish alone, he ends up throwing it away. I can't stand the waste, yet can't stop him, so in the end I give in. Little by little, I actually get used to eating breakfast with Brian on mornings when I have class. That winter felt unusually cold. The breath you exhaled one second would crystallize into a mist of ice the next. Freshmen were testing themselves half to death in the classroom. When it ended, their foggy brains were shocked awake by the freezing wind outside, and they flocked together, chattering about how they'd spend the winter break. It seemed that as long as you didn't fail a class, all was well with the world. Brian was flying to New Zealand for winter break in the new year. His family had already set out ahead of him, and they'd bought his ticket too. Right before the holiday he asked me out to discuss what to do with the orange cat. When all is said and done, Little Rose is his cat. But the worried father feared his pampered, spoiled son might not adapt if he went to Australia. So he asked if he could board him at my place for a while. I hesitated, fell silent for a moment, and couldn't give a definite answer. I'll see what I can do. For someone like Brian, arranging pet boarding isn't really a big deal. He probably came to me first because it was convenient. My home is local, and we wouldn't need to prepare extra supplies. Simply taking in a kitten over the winter break shouldn't, by any measure, be a big problem. So when he first heard my answer, Brian naturally took it as a polite excuse, that I didn't actually want to take on the hassle. But no, I truly needed to figure something out. In stark contrast to Brian's smooth and glittering life, I haven't had a home since the car accident in 8th grade. My uncle and aunt took the compensation money from my parents and raised me. The reason I chose T University was painfully simple: it offered the largest scholarship. Living under someone else's roof, I could hardly take proper care of myself, let alone a cat. In the blink of an eye, winter break arrived. At the agreed time I waited at the entrance to the boys' dorm to pick up the cat, only to see Brian come out empty-handed. "Where's the cat?" "Not coming." Hands in his pockets, his tone was cool, with a natural touch of distance. I knew he'd misunderstood and didn't explain. I just said oh, and was about to leave. But an arm stopped me. "Sorry." It was Brian, apologizing to me. "I didn't realize boarding the cat would be so hard for you." He spoke with open, sincere candor. My eyes lowered, the arc of my lashes blocked my view so I could only see the ashy concrete at my feet. The crack in the ground ran outward, to some invisible end. My family situation isn't a secret, yet at that moment an odd sense of embarrassment washed over me. "You don't need to apologize." I lifted my head, doing my best to look as calm and detached as ever. But Brian suddenly smiled. "The cat didn't come, but there's something else I want to leave with you." He opened his palm, a key and a building access card threaded together lay on his clean white hand. "This is my own place. No one goes there usually, right now only the cat's staying there. He's probably been missing you these past few days." Once the holiday truly began, I found a part-time job at a convenience store near my uncle's place, and every so often I tutored middle schoolers. If I finished early on a given day, I'd take the bus to Brian's apartment and spend half an afternoon playing with the orange cat. Count it as a little vacation for myself. After my parents passed away, they left behind 2 properties. The one in the city center is where my aunt and uncle, their son, and I live now. It's the old apartment where I spent more than 10 years with my parents. Everything is familiar, yet every time I go back, I feel like an outsider. On Spring Festival Day, the temperature dropped to 10 below zero. Because my cousin's maternal grandmother had arrived, our family ate New Year's Eve dinner early. Everyone squeezed into the small living room, chatting and laughing, except my cousin, who'd had a huge fight with his parents over his grades a couple days earlier and still wore a sulky face. And so I got hauled out as a model child again. My aunt humored the performance, only my cousin's grandmother took offense at her grandson being compared unfavorably. The old lady tossed off, "What good is it for a girl to know so much? Our James will amount to great things." Since the elders had spoken, the scene duly developed toward parental benevolence and filial obedience. I sat alone on a stool at the right, watching the Spring Festival gala for a while. Amid the merriment, my silence looked especially out of place. In the end, I grabbed the keys and left, on the pretext of going for a walk. Because it was the holiday, the buses had shut down early. By chance I caught one last run. I rode in an empty carriage and, after looping around, still got off near Brian's place. Brian's apartment has 2 big floor-to-ceiling windows. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I sat on the floor before the windows with Little Rose in my arms, in the dark. Down by the river, someone started setting off fireworks. Blossoms of light burst against the deep, silent sky. A canopy of brilliance, trees of flame and showers of silver. Suddenly, the apartment lock clicked. Brian came in wearing a not-so-thick cashmere coat, carrying the road's cold on him. He said Australia hadn't been much fun, better to come home and see little Rose. Brian picked out 2 freeze-dried treats to entice his longed-for, unfilial son. Little Rose only yawned lazily in my arms and didn't spare him a glance. He didn't get mad. He walked over and sat right beside me. Magnificent fireworks reflected on the glass, scattering into brief starlight. Top scholar, am I the first guy to watch fireworks with you? Brian suddenly looked at me, the fireworks in his eyes were bright as a galaxy. My heart skipped for no reason. I hugged little Rose tighter and didn't answer. Brian turned his head back. He propped himself up on his arms behind him, casual and unforced. As the fireworks were about to fade, I heard him say, "But you are?" When school started again, Brian and I resumed our punctual handoff of the orange cat every day. Sometimes Brian organized what he called a top scholar session. In truth, it meant I lectured while he, his roommates, and his buddies patched their gaps. For that, Brian even rented a small place off campus to serve as a temporary classroom. The grand start fizzled ignominiously halfway through, an enterprise undone before its prime. Brian's friends studied until their faces went green, as if the books were demons sucking away their life force. Not only that, they even tried to recruit me to a bar to broaden my horizons. The fruit platters there are great. Little Teacher Green, you can eat all you want, Brother Brian will pick up the tab. Hearing that, Brian only lifted his eyelids lazily, curled his lips, and didn't refute it. Though the session disbanded, the rental stayed. Brian had signed for a year, canceling meant losing at least 3 months of deposit. Without thinking about it, he handed me the keys. I need a place for my naps. The rest of the time, it's yours. For all that, I was the one who used it almost all the time. On the rare occasions I actually caught Brian asleep on the sofa, he never chased me out. Half asleep, he'd even murmur through a drowsy nose for me to pull a cover over him. But there weren't any such household items in a temporary rental, so I had to drape my own coat over him. By then Brian had drifted off again. His eyes were closed, his eye sockets deep, his lashes thick, sweeping like fans against his lower lids, the shadows they cast fell just right. When I gathered up my notes to head to class, I realized Brian was already awake. He sat on the sofa hugging my coat, a little dazed from sleep. I went to take my coat back. He only held it tighter. Puzzled, I tugged again. Brian seemed to wake from a dream, he wiped a hand over his face and let go. "Thanks, just now." I'd never heard his voice so low and hoarse. I didn't know what exactly he was thanking me for, yet for no reason my ears went warm. I left in a fluster, but something inside me, once cracked open, could no longer be contained. It broke through and spilled out. In the second semester of freshman year, our class advisor assigned a research topic. The school lacked the specialized books, so we wound up at the city library. And there I ran into Brian, who was there to borrow materials too. He'd left an empty seat beside him, clearly saving it for someone. I don't know what got into me, but I deliberately circled around that table. The library was packed on the weekend. I stood there hugging a stack of textbooks, wavering for ages, then suddenly received a text, "Top scholar, look up." I looked up on instinct. Brian was smiling, tapping the empty seat he'd saved with his pen. I went over with my head down and murmured a thanks as I sat close. The texts were dense, by late afternoon my head throbbed. I rubbed my eyes and, without thinking, glanced to the side, only to find Brian propping his forehead with a hand, eyes closed. "Hey," I called softly. When he didn't respond, I prodded the back of his hand with the end of my pen. Brian caught it. "Got you." He held the tip of my pen, grinning like a little fox whose trick had worked. Heat rose in my cheeks for no good reason, and I simply let him keep the pen. Brian stretched, and suddenly noticed the sky outside had gone dim. "How did you get here?" "I didn't follow." "By bus," I answered. Brian pointed at the library's tall windows. "It's clouding over." Only then did I notice the weather turning. I hurried to pack up for the bus. Once I squeezed on board, I saw he'd sent me a photo of the pen. Caption, "Works like a dream." I couldn't help it, a puff of laughter slipped out on the bus. The AC was blasting. I was drowsy and freezing awake by turns. After a while on the road, the sky suddenly shifted to a weird yellow-brown. An auntie nearby muttered, "Oh dear, looks like a downpour's coming." A downpour, it was only 5 in the afternoon, yet the day had turned pitch dark. I called Brian, but the line was busy. Thunder boomed, aggressive and looming, the wind and rain were gathering. I hung up and got off at the next stop. I bought 2 umbrellas, then hurriedly hailed a cab back to the library. Halfway there, the rain came bucketing down. Water pooled outside the city library, passing taxis all flipped on the red occupied light. The dense rain had woven itself into a curtain. As I got closer, I saw a crowd gathered at the entrance. One tall, lean young man stood out. Brian. He had just shoved his phone back into his pocket when a slim figure, me, came wading up with an umbrella from the side of the library. I saw the weather turning and you didn't bring an umbrella. I meant to drop one off and head back. Didn't expect the rain to start halfway. Water had gotten into my eyes. I tried to wipe them with my sleeve, only to find half my arm was already soaked. Seeing Brian still standing there, silently watching me, I suddenly felt awkward. Cabs can't pull up nearby. Before I finished, Brian took the umbrella handle. He pressed his lips together, no smile, and draped the thin jacket he'd taken off earlier over my shoulders. You're soaked. Only then did I register my bedraggled state. I moved to shrug the coat off and return it. Do you want to catch a cold? Brian pulled it back on me himself. Just then, someone nearby got picked up by a private car. I realized that, unlike me, Brian probably never needed to brave the rain for a bus or taxi. Right then, he nudged my arm. Top scholar, when's the next bus back to campus? I glanced at him, puzzled, but opened the transit app anyway. 5 minutes. Brian bent to roll up his pant legs. He eyed the rain nearly lapping over the steps, stuffed both umbrellas back into my hands, and crouched down. I didn't move. Brian looked back, expression steady as ever. Up you get. Wait any longer and we'll miss the bus. I blinked. Don't your family pick you up? They do. Brian nodded solemnly. Aren't you here to pick me up? His eyes were deep and bright, the corners slightly tilted, earnest without affectation. I met those starry eyes for a heartbeat, then flustered, looked away. In the end, I climbed onto Brian's back. In a situation that required wading through water, the advantage of being 189 was obvious. Brian hooked his arms under my legs to hold me steady, then stood and plunged into the rain. The slanting downpour wrapped us at once. His plain t-shirt soaked through, tracing the sturdy lines of his back. One of my hands held an umbrella, the other curled around the young man's neck. My palm was cool, damp with rain. After the deluge came a rare stretch of fine weather. Once we uploaded our project report, our advisor miraculously gave us 2 days off. Naturally, little Rose was entrusted to me full-time again. I'll take him back on my birthday, Brian said. His birthday was at month's end. I carried little Rose while browsing Taobao, and finally decided to go to the mall to buy him a gift. My roommate came along, eager to play strategist. Male or female? How old? How tall? How heavy? Good build or not? I reported Brian's stats one by one. She made a snap decision and marched me into a streetwear shop. Didn't you say he always wears this brand? When buying a present, you have to choose the smallest, finest thing within budget. A cap like this would be perfect. It was my first time in a streetwear store. I flipped a tag at random, and the world went black. A single cap cost 4 figures, my roommate fell silent too. We stepped out and headed to the convenience store next door for a bottle of iced water to cool off. After a few steps, she tugged at my sleeve in secret. I followed her cue and turned my head. My first glance fell on Brian in the crowd. Besides 2 friends, there was a girl I'd never seen. A beauty so striking she seemed almost aggressive. She walked at Brian's side, fanning herself idly with a baseball cap. They say Brian's been acting like he's in love lately. Could it be with that girl? My roommate's tone held open admiration. The cap in her hand is the same model as the one in the store just now. So this is what people mean by the gap between worlds. Watching them breeze in and out of luxury boutiques as casually as if strolling a market, I suddenly felt at ease. Everyone's family background and experience are different to begin with. Brian has his own social circle and values. I have mine. What we give each other is, in essence, equal. There's no need to belittle or embarrass myself just to fit into someone else's circle. So I turned with my roommate and went to a shop on the basement level. This is a water bottle I've liked for ages. From a shelf crowded with choices, I picked an orange thermos printed with all kinds of little cats. My roommate lifted the pink and white cherry blossom cat bottle beside it. This one's adorable too. I like that one as well, I said with a laugh, tilting my mouth. But my wallet doesn't. Brian's birthday came quickly. He chose the apartment with the river view for the party. I asked for leave and went early to settle little Rose in. Brian had just woken up. The birthday boy, still in pajamas and bleary-eyed, took the cat carrier from me. Son, did you get fat again? By a few months old, little Rose had gone from a delicate milk kitten to a greasy middle-aged uncle. But a father's filter is thick, he insisted his boy was the most handsome Tom in the neighborhood. Having claimed the apartment as his territory, little Rose walked straight toward his bowl the instant he stepped out of the carrier, leaving Brian nothing but a fluffy backside. Brian raked a hand through the cat fur-laden air and yawned. I called, they said we can get little Rose neutered soon. I crouched down, tossed the new teething ball beside the cat bed, and, laughing, lifted little Rose's front paws. Once you get refined, you'll be an Uncle Cat. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows into the living room. Big Rose squinted, dozing in the warm light. Should we shut him in the guest room? Brian thought for a moment. He's probably not afraid of strangers. True enough, he'd grown up on handouts from every household. He could even find himself a long-term meal ticket. One wasn't enough, then two. After changing, Brian happened to spot the gift bag by the cat carrier. This is for me. I said. I went to the mall the other day. Brian came over, leaning casually against the desk in front of me, one brow lifting. I saw you. I looked up, confused. Saw me? I saw you, on the second floor, he said, lowering his head to look at me. You were buying iced drinks with a friend. I didn't know how to respond. Say that I was with a friend and it wasn't convenient? Or that I'd seen him with his girlfriend and so hadn't said hello? He suddenly leaned in a little. Did you see me? I pressed my lips together and, in the end, shook my head. He didn't press. He unhurriedly opened the wrapping. When he saw the orange bottle, he chuckled. So this is for me? That could be a problem. I knew the gift didn't quite fit Brian, but when the mismatch was right there, I still felt a sting of embarrassment. No, actually, this. Brian didn't hand it back. He pulled open a drawer and took out another thermos. I bought a duplicate. This one's for you. He shoved it into my arms with a force that brooked no refusal. Helpless, I opened the dust bag, and found the pink and white cherry blossom cat bottle my wallet had vetoed. In the afternoon, after I got little Rose settled, I was ready to leave. The guest list wasn't long, just a few of Brian's closer friends. Brian didn't insist I stay, but his buddies wouldn't have it. How can little Teacher Green leave? Without little Teacher Green to hold down the table, we'll flip it over. I had no idea what they meant, yet I was still forcibly kept. After the cake, someone suggested a walk by the river and a spin through the night market. A new ghost marriage-themed escape room had opened there, supposedly with live NPCs. Of course I refused, but his buddies gave me no chance. They called in a girl to be my +1 on the spot. And so I saw that girl for the second time. I cancelled all my dates tonight. If this isn't fun, then you're my fun, she said. She must have known the guys well. She handed her bag to one of them without a second thought, then followed the group into the escape room. A forthright personality, a privileged family, and striking looks. In every respect, she was evenly matched with Brian. She saw me too, but said nothing, she only gave the faintest smile. The long, immersive pre-brief was tedious but effective. I sat in the dim room, palms sweating. Brian was a little far from me, in that patch of darkness, everyone's face was a blur. Once we entered the set, I realized I wasn't the only one afraid. Brian's buddy let out the first blood-curdling scream, opening the curtain on this ghost marriage. Chased by an NPC until my mind went blank, I staggered forward, and was suddenly grabbed and pulled beneath an offering table. It was that girl. Thank you. I was panting so hard that even those simple words came out breathless. She gave a mischievous little laugh. You're so timid. It's my first time doing this, so, I started to defend myself, but the more I spoke, the weaker my voice grew. She suddenly patted my head. How cute. No wonder they like having you along. Cute? I was baffled. No one had ever used that word for me. The girl didn't explain, she just clapped a hand over my mouth. The underworld guards coming. Sure enough, the drag of iron chains drew near, hovered for a while, then slowly receded. She pulled me out, frowning. We need to find the door. It should be over there. I pointed to a nondescript hanging scroll in the corner. That's where the sound came from. With someone beside me, I was clearly calmer than before. Out of the ancestral hall, we entered the wedding bow scene. 2 red paper lanterns hung in the gloom. On the offering table below, the left held dragon and phoenix candles, while the right held a single white taper. A coffin stood in the seat of honor, empty. A moment later I knew why it was empty. Because the girl was dragged inside and locked in. Outside, I was forced to put on wedding robes and wait to bow with the next unlucky soul. Then Brian and his best buddy appeared. At the word bow, the buddy leapt to volunteer. Seeing me in wedding red, he turned ashen. Terribly sorry, excuse me. The NPC and I were both confused. In the end, we had to pull Brian in to make up the numbers. We bowed twice toward the coffin as required, and a weird sound effect rose. The speaker was too close, I flinched on instinct. A weeping, wailing ghostly voice set all my hairs on end. Brian quietly slipped something into my ear. A tiny Bluetooth earbud. And it was playing gentle rain sounds. After I linked up with Brian, everything suddenly got easier, yet by the time we exited, everyone was drenched in sweat. The girl tied up her hair and sat on the railing to touch up her makeup. One of the guys bought a few bottles of iced drinks. The girl took 2, walked over, and handed one to me. Brian happened to come back as well, with 2 bottles in his hands. She glanced at his and curled her lip. Yours is too sweet. Brian's buddy followed empty-handed. Have a heart, I don't mind sweet. I'm dying of thirst. I laughed and took the tea from the girl. Thank you for earlier. You should thank me. She looked at me and lowered her voice. Strictly speaking, we're love rivals. I didn't get it. She pointed at Brian. I like him too. When we were done strolling, the girl took a cab back to her university. With a head full of thoughts, I went with Brian to pick up Little Rose and return to the dorm. Little Rose had probably run himself ragged, he was asleep by the door. When we came in, he walked over on his own and crouched by the carrier to lick his paws. Brian went over to ruffle his head and asked me, do you think he considers himself a shared cat now? Though I believed he merely thought he'd gained another subject in the cat kingdom, I still suggested, why don't we give him a name? They say a pet only feels a sense of belonging once it has a name. Brian agreed. Then let's call him Little Rose. Brian suddenly laughed. You name him, top scholar. He scratched the orange cat under the neck, then stroked from crown to back. The kitten squinted, a contented purr rumbling in his throat. But the second Brian stopped, he stretched, shook his fur, and walked straight toward me. Brian huffed a laugh, scooped up the orange cat, and muttered, you little ingrate. Back at the dorm, my roommates weren't in yet. I turned on the desk lamp to preview my coursework, but my thoughts wouldn't stick to the page. The girl had said she also liked Brian. But she'd also said Brian doesn't like her. If I'm this outstanding and have so many suitors, why must I be with someone who doesn't like me? And you, do you like Brian? Do I like Brian? But if Brian doesn't even like a girl that exceptional, then who would he like? It rained overnight. At some point Little Rose ran onto my bed, the fur along his back was soaked, and he curled by my pillow looking utterly miserable. My heart clenched. I wrapped him in a towel and texted Brian. Before I could set my phone down, Brian called back. My roommates were asleep, so I took the call under the covers with the cat in my arms. Brian sounded a little exasperated, swearing he'd teach his unfilial son a lesson tomorrow. Little Rose mewed pitifully against my chest. I stroked his head, the fur was still damp and not yet dry. My heart ached more. I whispered a defense, he didn't mean to. Brian huffed, he can pick locks now. I stared wide-eyed at Little Rose, he burrowed into my arms and let out a babyish meow. I was just about to soften. Wheedling to mommy won't work. Brian stayed merciless on the other end. I froze. Brian also fell silent. After a while I stammered, changing the subject, my roommates, they're all asleep. Awkwardly, I hung up. The night was deep, and I lay awake with Little Rose in my arms. Half a month later, Brian's advisor took him abroad for a month-long academic exchange. With no other choice, he entrusted his only son to me, full authority. Come June, the strays near the dorms were going into heat, and even Little Rose grew restless. I remembered Brian mentioning last month that Little Rose should be neutered. Stealing time with the chubby cat in tow, I consulted several animal hospitals and finally booked the full snip-snip package. It wasn't cheap, but I gathered my small savings and scholarship, my wallet wouldn't collapse at once. Before the surgery, I cooperated with the vet to put on a melodramatic scene of lovers torn apart. Little Rose's gaze was icy, as if he had already seen through us foolish mortals. But an accident happened just as it began. Little Rose had an adverse reaction to the anesthesia. His body trembled, they wheeled him to the end of the corridor. I took 2 steps and the world went black. I fumbled to call Brian, then remembered he was far away overseas. Clutching my phone in a daze, I let the intake nurse guide me to a bench in the waiting area. When they wheeled Little Rose back out, I was still in a fog. As if in the next instant, this fat little cat would hop down and fling himself into my arms. But no. He lay motionless on the cart, only the faint rise and fall of his chest proved he was alive. He'll get better, won't he? I looked at the doctor like a drowning person catching the last straw. Behind the mask I couldn't read his face, he only recited calmly, we'll do our best. Little Rose lay unconscious, the danger hadn't passed. I withdrew my savings and watched the numbers flow like water onto the hospital bill. It took 3 whole days for the kitten to wake. He was visibly thinner, my heart ached. He couldn't even make a sound. I stroked his head, he had no strength, yet he still struggled to put his crown into my palm. Eyes stinging, I told him again and again that mommy wouldn't give up on him, that mommy would make him well. The last sum on the bill went through, my part-time job couldn't advance my pay any further. I asked a friend about day-wage work, she hesitated, then led me quietly to her cousin's workplace. The bar's music was deafening. A fashionably dressed girl slung an arm around my shoulders. Can you carry trays? If yes, you're hired. She got me into a server's uniform and offered quick advice. Take the tip if they give it, if anyone gets handsy, go find security. Short shifts at the bar were no picnic, lots of drunks, lots of nonsense. Now and then someone would flirt or cop a feel, but the old hands helped fend them off. Thankfully the tips were decent, with frugality, they would cover little Rose's care. Classes by day, bar work past midnight, and any free moment at the hospital with little Rose. Even my roommates joked I'd turned into a ghost, floating on sore feet, as if the beauties in my books had drained my young energy. One day, while I was smoothing Big Rose's fur, Brian called. He was back in the country. My feelings were complicated. From start to finish, I hadn't told him about the hospitalization. But as little Rose's real owner, Brian was the one who most needed to know. I still didn't say it when we met. Brian's buddies had prepared a surprise welcome dinner after his month away. I wandered in by accident and couldn't just turn and leave. A month gone hadn't changed him much. They dragged him straight to the restaurant, he hadn't even changed clothes. He probably hadn't adjusted his jet lag yet. Lounging in the main seat, he sipped tea from a thermos. An orange thermos, printed with all kinds of cute cats. One buddy snorted. "Bro, where'd you dig that up?" Brian glanced up. "Jealous? Got any taste at all?" Little Teacher Green gave it to him, "It's adorable." Another friend smacked the joker and shoved him the menu. "Order, order. Little Teacher Green, don't sit by the aisle. There's a seat free next to me, come sit here." I couldn't refuse, and was just taking my bag over when Brian stopped me. "The AC's blasting on that side. The wind's too harsh. Sit here." The other guy clicked his tongue. "Fine, making wedding robes for someone else." Brian laughed and lobbed 2 cherries at him. Sitting by Brian did ease some of my nerves. They didn't drink, so dinner didn't drag on. Someone suggested moving on to play somewhere else. Brian waved it off. "No worries. My family took a stake in this hotel at New Year's. We can just give the manager a heads up." A chorus of teasing groans rose. The hotel stood in a bustling commercial district, the first 5-star place I'd ever set foot in. Watching the others settle back to normal after the ribbing, I suddenly understood the gulf that class draws. Brian and I, perhaps we were never the same kind of people. After eating, one buddy proposed a round of truth or dare, newly back in vogue. Too many close friends, though, and you run out of tricks. A few calls later, 8 or 9 guys and girls, some close, some not, had gathered. We sat in a circle. With each spin, the questions grew spicier, and dare became the fallback. After a bit, the bottle landed on me. I was surprised, it was my first time all night. The guy opposite me was also in finance, a senior, technically. He was outgoing and good-looking, somewhat known in the department. He blinked when the bottle picked me, then grinned. I chose truth, and he tossed out a teasing question. "Lisa Green, I saw someone at King Bar last time, that was you, wasn't it?" My face changed at once. I had tried to avoid school acquaintances, and still I'd been recognized. I had no shame about working there, but who knew how filthy the story would become in others' mouths. Before I could speak, Brian cut in. "If you saw Lisa, how come you didn't see me?" He glanced at the buddy, who chuckled in turn. "My family owns the place. We were giving Little Teacher Green fruit platters as tutoring fees." "Problem." Laughter rippled around us. "Lucas Smith, and what were you doing there?" Lucas Smith's face went pale, he made an excuse and left early. Brian snorted and looked away. "Next." "Nope, you still owe a dare after a truth." Unable to fight the crowd's mischief, Brian brought over the card box for me to draw. I was still stuck on how he'd covered for me, and my fingers brushed the edge. His fingertips were cool, the light touch sent a tremor racing from my hand through me. My dare was to call the most recent contact in my phone and confess. I exhaled in relief, no one knew the poverty of my social circle better than I did. I opened my call log, only to find the very top was Brian, sitting right beside me. I instinctively darkened my phone screen. Brian tilted his head, puzzled. "What's wrong? Who's first?" I looked at him. He froze, coughed dryly, and turned away in a fluster. "Little Teacher Green's phone is broken." "Next." A chorus of knowing ohs rose. Heat flooded my face, the phone in my palm turned into a timed bomb. That round, mercifully, was skipped. In the end, no matter how approachable Brian seemed, his golden heritage made people wary. Once they realized the target of my confession would be him, no one pushed it. We played until 8, night had fallen. People drifted off in 2s and 3s, until only Brian and I remained. The room felt suddenly empty. Brian stood. I thought he was leaving, but he only went to shut the cracked door. I stopped, unsure, and stayed where I was. He turned back and asked, "What happened on the 17th and 18th? Those were the days little Rose fought for his life. You didn't answer any of my messages those 2 days, and on the 19th everything was suddenly normal again." I pressed my lips together and stared down, at a loss for how to begin. I didn't take proper care of him? I took it on myself to make him like this? Too flimsy, Brian suddenly strode to me, stammering apologies. I'm sorry. You don't have to be scared or remember it. I shouldn't have asked. He clumsily wiped at my eyes with his hand. Whatever it is, whoever it is, I can handle it. Just say the word. Don't cry. His words only sharpened my guilt. It's my fault. I put little Rose in the hospital. Little Rose? Brian's hand paused. After a long moment he swore softly, then laughed. Damn. That's embarrassing. He scrubbed his face, belatedly catching up. Little Rose is sick. In the pet ward, Brian gently touched the sleeping cat. When the orange Tom's ear twitched, he snatched his hand back. This isn't your fault. I shook my head and forced a light tone. I know that, logically. I just can't shake the guilt so fast. Brian offered a soothing smile. Leaning closer to the bed, he murmured, Mom's done her best. From here on, leave it to Dad, okay? After little Rose was discharged, Brian's friends even held a mock celebration. Slimmed down by several degrees, the orange cat rode the robot vacuum, deigned to snatch the choicest salmon belly from Dad's hand. While two uncles popped imaginary confetti and yanked open a red banner that read, Congratulations to our nephew on his recovery. The other two clapped with exaggerated fervor. Tail high, little Rose made a full circuit around their feet, then flopped right down in front of me. Meow. I couldn't help it, I rubbed his white, fluffy belly. Meow, he wheedled and rumbled with pleasure. Groans rose in chorus across the room. Oh, my Uncle Heart is shattered. Why? He let me hold him when he was little. He only loved you briefly, out of sheer boredom. A buddy squeaked, Brian, how can a mouth at 36 degrees say something so cold? Brian snorted, scooped up little Rose, and asked, Son, do you love Daddy or Mommy more? Heat rushed to my face, I ducked my head on instinct. Little Rose calmly licked a paw, then used Brian's arm as a step and perched on his cheap dad's shoulder. A buddy laughed at him. Brian, how dare you ask that kind of question? Aren't you asking to be humiliated? Another smacked him from behind. What do you know? Come on, class time. Brian waved them off. I'm free this afternoon. You go. I grabbed my backpack to follow the others out, but Brian shut the door first. He rubbed the bridge of his nose and muttered, I was a bit embarrassed to say this just now in front of everyone. Nervous, I twisted my fingers, unsure where to rest my gaze. Brian took a breath and lifted his head. I've wanted to say this for a while. Lisa, would you give little Rose a complete home? I blinked, then couldn't help laughing. What is that? Brian didn't laugh. He took 2 steps forward and stated, in the plainest yet most solemn tone, the kind that begins with dating and ends at the altar. A short sentence, yet it slammed into my heart. My fingertips trembled. After steadying myself, I nodded. I agree, to date you. Brian stressed, and to marry. I pressed a smile. Maybe after graduation you'll think we're not a good match. He suddenly held me, brows drawn in a light crease. I'll work to become better, to be worthy of you. I let out a helpless laugh. I meant me. Brian, do you really not understand? He stared, wrong-footed. Why would you think that? Don't you know how exceptional you are? He hugged me tighter, a hint of grievance in his voice. My family and friends kept knocking me down, saying if it weren't for the cat, a top scholar like you wouldn't even look my way. How could that be? You're the one I could never reach. Brian guided my hand to his cheek. This person belongs to you now. Give him a little confidence, will you? My heart melted to softness, my eyes burned. Okay. Let's both give each other a bit more faith. Another winter break came, and little Rose finally grew into a true big rose. A 4-person dorm could no longer contain an orange piglet of a cat, so I filed a request and, cat and all, moved off campus. After I got my professional certification, there were far more part-time jobs to choose from, some even paid handsomely. I rented a tiny studio, just 1 bedroom opening into a small living room, but more than enough for 1 person and 1 cat. Within 2 days, that more than enough studio felt crowded. Wife, can I hang my coat here? I stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching the boy voluntarily stuffing clothes into my wardrobe, and refused mercilessly, no. Okay, then I won't hang it. Brian obeyed at once, took the expensive coat off the hanger, balled it up, and stuffed it straight into the closet. I sighed, shook out the pickle of a coat, and hung it properly. Once I left a crack, a certain someone grew bolder. We squeezed in together for half a year. Once I'd settled on my field and direction, I started preparing for grad school. Brian pledged 100% cooperation, and that very night cleared out a room in the Riverview apartment. I was baffled. Brian analyzed with cool precision, it's quieter here. The commute's convenient. And the internet's faster. Too persuasive to refute. But when I began prepping application materials, something went wrong. Or rather, the inevitable finally landed on the table. Brian found out the program I was applying to wasn't in the country. We had our first argument. He stubbornly believed I was going to start something and then abandon him, since I'd once turned down his suggestion that we study abroad together. Tall, handsome, the young man managed to look outright aggrieved. He stood in the doorway, eyes red. "Did you decide this long ago?" I wanted to nod, and even more, to go hug him. But I knew we both needed to cool down. So I chose to open the door and leave. Big Rose trotted after me. His plump body bobbed, even the tips of his fur fluffed. He ran a couple steps, turned, and plunked down on my shoes. Meow. I nudged him with my toe. He didn't budge, rock solid. I stepped around him and took 2 more steps. He repeated the exact same move. "Come on." Helpless, laughing and crying at once, I bent to scoop him up. No, Daddy and Mommy aren't getting divorced. Back at my rental with Big Rose, I was sweaty and hadn't even had a sip of water when the doorbell rang. Brian stood at the door, expressionless. I thought he'd come to demand an explanation. Instead, the moment I opened up, he slipped inside, catching me off guard. "Wife, I was wrong." Carefully, he took my fingers. "Can we not run back to your parents with our son every time we fight?" "For the record," I said, "our son followed me of his own accord." Inside, Big Rose had deftly fished his old mouse toy from under the sofa. Brian patted his head and declared, righteous as a judge, "My son and I are an inseparable unit." I set the kettle to boil and, when I came back, corrected him in passing, "Your son is an uncle now." Brian clapped his hands over Big Rose's ears. "How can you poke his sore spot in front of the child?" We each held a cup of hot water on opposite ends of the sofa, blowing it cool in small sips. Brian suddenly returned to the earlier topic. "How long have you had this plan?" "Since I finished the GRE test," I said honestly. "So, in your plan for the future, is there a place for me?" He looked straight at me. The eyes that were usually deep and bright now seemed veiled in mist, hiding too many feelings. For a moment, I forgot how to answer. Brian gave the briefest smile and then lifted his chin. "If I took out a ring right now, would it be ridiculous?" I watched the slight tremor of his fingertips, stayed silent a beat, then answered softly, "I'm willing." Brian snapped upright, and a beat later fumbled at his pocket for the ring. I stepped over and pressed his shoulder. "Brian, I'll accept your proposal anytime, anywhere. Just, not now." He lifted his head, 1,000 emotions moved through his eyes, and none of them found words. He believed my reasons. He trusted me. So I honored that trust and laid out my heart. I don't want to be just Ms. Anderson, or Mom Anderson. When people mention me, I want the first thing they think of to be my own name. That doesn't mean I don't love you. I leaned down and hugged him. He was full of doubts, yet didn't interrupt. He simply wrapped an arm around my waist and listened, quiet, to everything I had to say. So I poured out my hopes for the future. "I want to stand closer to you, on my own strength, closer and closer. I hope, in time, to be your equal arm. Your fallback. The bugle that lets you charge without fear." Brian's arms tightened. His voice came out muffled, red rimmed his eyes, yet he stared stubbornly into mine. "What you just said, does that count as a proposal?" I laughed. "Of course it does." He lifted my right hand and pressed a reverent kiss to my ring finger. "I'm willing, too. No matter the time difference from 116 degrees east to 41 degrees north, or the miles spanning the Pacific, my heart is a stone, unmoved."